Welcome to the Missing Dots. For 14 centuries, one of Islam's most powerful psychological technologies has been misunderstood, diluted, and reduced to a caricature. Zuhd was never about poverty, weakness, or running away from the world. It was a discipline of power, a state of inner sovereignty where the richest men in the empire lived with the clarity of monks, not because they lacked wealth, but because wealth never owned their hearts. This is the forgotten science of detachment. A system that produced leaders who built cities, commanded armies, managed vast trade networks, yet slept on rough mats and ate simple bread. Today, in an age of hyperconsumerism, dopamine addiction, and identity built on branding, the original Zuhd is not just relevant, it is revolutionary.
It really changes everything once you see it clearly, just sitting here after prayer reflecting on the way we live today. How our entire environment is engineered to make us crave more. It really feels like we are living in the exact opposite state of what that early generation achieved.
We really have. We are constantly bombarded.
Right. And when you read the historical and linguistic research we're looking at today, you start to realize how completely we have lost the thread on what this ancient concept was actually supposed to do for the human mind.
Exactly. And I want to bring you, the listener, right into the middle of this conversation, because we're looking at this massive study put together by historians, sociologists, scholars of classical Arabic, and psychologists.
It's a really diverse group.
Yeah, and their goal was to completely deconstruct the way the modern world, and even the modern Muslim world, thinks about this concept of Zuhd.
Because the current understanding is just broken.
It is.
Yeah.
They argue that returning to the original framework might actually be one of the only viable ways to survive the modern attention economy. Think about your own day-to-day life. You open an app, you walk down the street, and the architecture of the modern world is actively designed to make you feel incomplete.
Oh, absolutely. You are supposed to feel like you are missing out.
Right. And the traditional translation we usually get in English for this concept, words like asceticism or renunciation, they just completely fail to capture the active, empowering reality of what the early Muslims were doing.
They fail because they map a very specific Western, often Christian monastic framework onto a completely different worldview.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When a modern English speaker hears asceticism, the image that comes to mind is very passive.
Yeah, my mind immediately goes to a guy living in a cave.
Exactly.
Someone who has completely rejected society, who wears scratchy, uncomfortable clothing, eats maybe half a loaf of bread a day, and refuses to even look at a gold coin.
Right, the classic hermit.
It sounds like a retreat, like running away because the world outside is too dangerous or too dirty or too corrupting to handle.
And that is the caricature. That's what people think it is. But if we go back to the philological roots, like the actual linguistics of the classical Arabic word, it tells a completely different story.
Okay, so what does the root actually mean?
So the scholars in this study went back to their earliest classical dictionaries, like the works of Al-Azhari and Ibn Faris. They looked at how the root letters, ZHD, were used by the Bedouins before they were ever layered with complex theology.
Right, the original everyday usage.
Exactly. And the root does not mean the absence of material things. It implies a calibrated disdain or a scarcity of regard towards something.
A scarcity of regard. That is a really interesting way to phrase it.
Right.
So what does that actually look like in practice? How do you have a scarcity of regard?
It is a psychological posture, not a material condition. It means you can look at a thing, whether it is a pile of gold, a position of power, or a luxury garment, and you recognize its worldly value, but you deliberately choose not to give it weight in your heart.
You just don't care about it emotionally.
Exactly. You withhold your reverence. And this brings us to a foundational rule that classical scholars established, which completely flips the modern understanding on its head.
What's the rule?
You cannot practice this discipline over something you do not possess or cannot attain.
Wait, hold on. I need to pause here because that is a massive point.
It changes everything.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the mechanics of this.
Yeah.
You are saying that true detachment is an active exercise of power. It is a restraint. It is not just a circumstance of being deprived and then slapping a spiritual label on it to feel better about being poor.
That is the core of it. If you have absolutely no access to wealth or influence and you say, well, I am practicing detachment from the world, the classical scholars would say, well, no, you aren't. You are simply experiencing poverty.
Wow.
Now, experiencing poverty requires immense patience, and there's profound spiritual reward in that patience. But patience in the face of deprivation, is not the same psychological technology as having the world at your fingertips and consciously restraining your heart from consuming it.
That makes perfect sense. There was an analogy in the source material that made this click for me.
The cake one.
Yeah, the cake analogy. I want the listener to picture this. Imagine there is a beautiful, expensive, incredibly decadent chocolate cake sitting right in front of me on the table.
Sounds good right now.
Right. So if I look at that cake, smell it, have the fork in my hand, and I actively decide to put the fork down and resist eating it, that takes a tremendous amount of willpower. I am exercising absolute control over a live, active desire.
Exactly. You have the option, but you choose restraint.
But if I am sitting in an empty room, the door is locked, and there's no cake within 10 miles of me, and I announce to the room, hey, I am resisting chocolate cake right now.
Yeah.
That is not willpower.
No, not at all.
That is just circumstance. I am taking credit for a situation I have zero control over.
It's a false sense of achievement.
Exactly. So applying that to money and status, does this mean that true top-tier detachment actually requires a person to have wealth, or at least the capacity to acquire it?
This was actually a major intellectual debate among the early scholars. They asked the exact same question. Al-Ghazali, who was arguably one of the most brilliant psychologists and theologians of the 11th century, spent a lot of time exploring this.
Right. He wrote volumes on the diseases of the heart.
He did. He created a sort of taxonomy of the human soul. And he wanted to know who has achieved a higher state of psychological sovereignty, the wealthy person who is detached or the poor person who is detached.
And what did he conclude? Because our modern bias almost universally assumes the poor person is more spiritual. We always root for the guy with nothing.
Right, but Al-Ghazali concluded that the wealthy person who conquers desire in its own domain has achieved a higher state of mastery.
In its own domain.
Yes. The person who has the gold in their hands, who has the power to buy whatever they want, to indulge in whatever status game they want, and yet refuses to let that wealth inflate their ego or dictate their identity, they have defeated the desire on the battlefield.
Wow.
The poor person, through no fault of their own, has simply had the battlefield removed.
That completely shifts the goalposts of what success looks like in this framework.
It really does.
We are so conditioned to view material success and spiritual success as a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
You know, the more you have of one, the less you have of the other. But Al-Ghazali is suggesting that the more you can handle without it corrupting your internal compass, the stronger you actually are.
It is all about capacity. Look at how the early masters defined it. Sufyan al-Thawri, a major classical authority, was very pragmatic. He said that this practice is not about making lawful things unlawful for yourself.
Right.
It is not about taking your hard-earned money and throwing it into the river just to prove a point. He defined it like this. He said, it is having more certainty in what is in God's hands than what is in your own hands.
I want to break that down because that sounds like one of those heavy philosophical phrases that is easy to nod along to but hard to actually live.
Oh, absolutely.
Having more certainty in what is in God's hands than what is in your own hands. The researchers in the paper call this ontological confidence.
Yes, a great term.
What does that mean for a regular person trying to feed their family today?
Ontological confidence basically means trusting the reality of the provider more than the reality of the provision.
Okay, give me an example.
If you are a normal person and you have $10,000 in your bank account, your natural human instinct is to feel secure because you can see the numbers on the screen. Your confidence is in the money.
Sure, it pays the rent.
Exactly. But if the market crashes and that money vanishes, your security vanishes with it because your foundation was tied to a material object that is subject to change.
You feel like your life is over.
Right. Sufyan al-Thawri is saying that a person with true detachment looks at the $10,000 and says, Alhamdulillah, this is a tool I currently have. But their internal sense of security doesn't come from the money. It comes from their relationship with the one who provided the money.
Right.
If the money disappears, they don't experience an existential crisis. They just assume the provision will come from a different direction tomorrow.
They don't fall apart because the foundation of their identity was never the money in the first place.
Exactly. And Al-Junayd, another major figure from the early period, gave what I consider the most precise psychological architecture for this. He said that this state is when the hands are emptied of possessions and the heart is emptied of pursuit.
Emptied of pursuit. So the hands might be empty, or they might be holding a massive business empire, but the heart is empty of the pursuit itself.
Yes.
Meaning your day-to-day obsessive thoughts, your anxiety, your need to prove yourself to your neighbors, none of that is wrapped up in acquiring more things.
The hands can hold millions, the hands can build cities, but the heart remains fundamentally quiet.
Which brings us to the most mind-bending part of this entire historical reality.
The early companions.
Yes, if the highest level of this discipline is holding wealth without loving it, without letting it colonize your heart, then we have to look at the people who actually defined and lived this practice. The early companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
And this is where the modern narrative gets it so wrong.
It really does. Because the narrative we are often sold today, even in historical documentaries or basic religious classes, is that these people were all living in total destitution. We picture them constantly starving, wearing the same patched garment for 20 years, and rejecting all commerce.
Right, like they hated money.
Exactly. But the economic data in this study tells a completely different story. Some of these individuals were among the wealthiest people in human history.
The wealth accumulated by some of the most senior companions is staggering. Even adjusted for modern inflation, we are talking about multimillionaires and in some cases, billionaires.
Billionaires.
Yes, they managed vast intercontinental trade networks. And this is where the romanticized narrative really falls apart. We try to force them into this box of passive poverty, but they were aggressive, highly capable merchants and state builders.
Let's talk about specific numbers, because
Yeah.
the data in the research is just wild. Take Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf. We are talking about a man who migrated from Mecca to Medina as a refugee.
Left everything behind.
Right. He arrived with practically nothing. He refused charity, went straight to the local market and started trading, just buying and selling basic goods. And by the time he passed away, his estate was astronomically large.
It was massive.
The historical records show he had 1,000 camels, 3,000 sheep, 100 horses. He left behind 4 wives, and the inheritance laws are very specific. Each wife inherited 80,000 dinars as just their fractional share of the estate.
Which is just a small percentage of the total.
Exactly. If you calculate the gold weight of those dinars into today's market value, his total estate was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He wasn't just a local shopkeeper. He was running a massive multinational logistics empire.
He was a titan of commerce. And yet, how did he carry himself in his daily life? This is the paradox that confuses people who don't understand the psychology we have been discussing.
How so?
He possessed all of that wealth, but he personally ate barley bread. He wore simple clothing that didn't distinguish him from his own workers.
You couldn't pick him out of a crowd.
Exactly. And there is a very famous, well-documented incident where a luxurious, high-quality meal was prepared and placed in front of him. A normal person would just eat it and enjoy the luxury.
You earned it.
Right. But Abd al-Rahman looked at the food and started weeping.
Over the food.
Yes.
Huh?
He remembered his close friends, the early companions who had died in battle years earlier before the community had any of this wealth. He remembered a specific companion who didn't even have enough cloth to serve as a proper burial shroud. If they covered his head, his feet were exposed.
Subhanallah.
Abd al-Rahman wept because he viewed his massive wealth as a terrifying psychological test. He was genuinely afraid that his reward was being rushed to him in this temporary world rather than being saved for the eternal one.
That is a profound level of self-awareness. You
Wow.
don't cry over a plate of food in the privacy of your own home if you were just putting on a public performance. He genuinely felt the existential weight of that abundance.
It is the reaction of a man who understands that every single coin he possesses is something he will have to answer for. And he wasn't an isolated case.
Right, there were others.
Look at Uthman ibn Affan, the third caliph of the Islamic Empire. He was also a merchant of immense wealth before he ever assumed political leadership.
What did he do?
During a critical moment for the community, there was a military crisis. They needed to outfit an entire army, known as the Army of Difficulty, to travel north. The state treasury didn't have the funds.
The government was broke.
Essentially, yes. So Uthman stepped up and financed the vast majority of the expedition from his own personal pocket. We are talking about 10,000 gold dinars, 1,000 loaded camels, and 100 horses.
I want the listener to really internalize the scale of that. Giving 1,000 camels in the 7th century isn't like donating a few cars. A camel was the premier vehicle of trade, transportation, and war.
It was heavy machinery.
Yeah, it would be like a modern tech billionaire buying a fleet of cargo planes and just handing over the keys to the government without asking for anything in return.
It was a massive transfer of liquid assets. And he did it without hesitation. When Uthman eventually passed away, his estate administrators found hundreds of thousands of gold dinars and 1 million silver dirhams in cash reserves, plus land holdings across the Hijaz, Egypt, and the Levant.
So he was incredibly wealthy even after giving all that away.
Yes. Yet the man who controlled the wealthiest empire on earth at the time was known to personally drink water without honey, which was a common luxury, and eat simple food. He fasted almost continuously. He spent his nights standing in prayer. His wealth was entirely external to his heart.
Okay, I have to step in here and play the skeptic, because if a modern listener is hearing this, especially someone with a background in economics or sociology, their alarm bells are going to be ringing.
Oh, for sure. It sounds almost too perfect.
Right. In the research paper, the authors outline what they call the polemics matrix. These are the really tough, skeptical questions that critics use to challenge this history. And the most common one is the accusation of structural hypocrisy.
The PR stunt argument.
Exactly. Today, we see a billionaire CEO who takes a $1 salary for the public relations optics. It looks incredibly humble on paper. But behind the scenes, they retain all their stock options, they fly on a private jet, and they live in a massive gated mansion.
Right.
So how do we know these early Muslims weren't just doing the 7th century equivalent of a PR stunt? You know, look how humble I am, eating my barley bread while sitting on a mountain of gold. How do we prove it wasn't just performative?
That is a very valid question, and historians do not just take people's words at face value, they look at long-term behavioral evidence.
Okay, what does the evidence show?
Well, a public relations stunt is usually thin, it requires constant maintenance, and it inevitably breaks down under extreme pressure or when the cameras are off, so to speak.
You can't fake it for 40 years.
Exactly. The companions demonstrated consistent, lifelong behavioral patterns that completely contradict the hypocrisy claim. First, let's look at their charity ratios.
Ratios are important.
Right. A modern billionaire might give away 1 or 2% of their net worth, usually to a foundation they control, and they get endless positive press for it.
Yeah, they put their name on a building.
Abdel Rahman ibn Auf was known to give away entire trade caravans. There is a documented record of him giving away a caravan of 700 loaded camels to the state treasury in a single transaction.
700.
You do not give away the core operational assets of your business at that scale if you are deeply attached to them or if you are just trying to manage your public image. That is a structural liquidation of your own wealth.
Right. 700 camels is a massive logistical enterprise. It is the equivalent of giving away your entire supply chain. You don't do that for a PR stunt.
You'd go bankrupt. Secondly, psychologists look at how people react to unexpected loss. When a person's core identity is deeply attached to their wealth, losing it causes a psychological breakdown.
Yeah, we see this in modern stock market crashes. People literally lose their will to live when they lose their portfolios because they feel they've lost themselves.
But these companions routinely forgave massive debts owed to them by struggling merchants. When their trade ships were lost at sea or investments failed in distant markets, they remained entirely calm. They viewed it simply as the provider moving provision from one location to another. There was no panic.
That's true ontological confidence.
And thirdly, their austerity was baked into how they governed. They didn't live in isolated, fortified palaces cut off from the working class. They sat in the dirt in the marketplace. They were accessible. You couldn't tell the caliph apart from a regular farmer based on his clothing.
Let me push back on this from another angle, focusing on Ali ibn Abi Talib. Because if you read his collected sermons, the Nahja Balagha, his words are often used by later generations to argue that wealth and the material world are inherently evil.
Yes, his rhetoric was very strong.
He uses some intensely dark phrasing. He calls the world a treacherous abode, a putrid carcass, a mortal poison.
Strong words.
Very strong. If a young person reads that today, they would naturally assume, wow, Ali must have hated the physical world. He must have believed that being poor was the only way to be pure.
That is a very common reading, but it completely strips his words of their practical context. Ali was not a hermit. He was actually a major landowner.
Really?
Yes, he owned extensive date palm orchards around Medina, and he didn't inherit them. He developed them through immense physical labor. He is documented as having dug hundreds of wells with his own hands in the Arabian heat to irrigate those orchards.
Digging a well by hand in the rocky soil of the Hijaz is not light work. That is heavy, exhausting, calluses on your hands, physical labor. You don't do that if you think the physical world is useless.
You certainly don't. So why did he do it? He didn't do it to build a luxury estate for himself. He developed these agricultural assets and then immediately endowed them as charitable trusts, as waqfs, for the benefit of the poor and the travelers.
Ah, so he gave it away.
Exactly. You cannot endow land if you do not own it and develop it first. So when we read his intense rhetoric calling the world a carcass or a poison, we have to understand he was not attacking the physical earth. He wasn't attacking commerce or farming or building infrastructure.
What was he attacking?
He was launching a targeted psychological attack on a very specific disease of the heart, al-itirar bil-dunya.
Being deceived by the world.
Exactly. The state of being lulled to sleep by worldly success. He was warning people against letting the comfort of their wealth make them forget their mortality. In one of his sermons, he actually defines what true detachment is, and it perfectly aligns with everything we've discussed.
What did he say?
He said that a person with this mindset does not grieve when they lose something from the world, and they do not rejoice with pride when they gain something from it.
Why?
The criterion is entirely about emotional regulation and psychological freedom. It has nothing to do with having an empty bank account.
That is a profound level of emotional regulation. Imagine the listener applying that today. You land $1 million contract, and your heart rate doesn't spike into arrogant euphoria. You lose $1 million contract, and your heart rate doesn't drop into despair.
Because your foundation is elsewhere.
Because your core identity, your sense of self-worth, is completely tethered to something outside the volatile material system.
And that individual psychological reality scales up to create a fascinating historical outcome. When you have an entire leadership class and a massive segment of the population operating with this mindset where they are earning aggressively but consuming minimally, it creates an unprecedented macroeconomic dynamic.
Yeah, the economics of this are fascinating because there is a massive assumption today in modern economics.
Yeah.
If you teach people to be detached, if you teach an entire population to be content with basic food and shelter, you are going to crash the economy.
That is the standard capitalist fear.
Right. Modern capitalism relies on manufactured desire. If no one wants to buy a new smartphone every year, if no one cares about upgrading their car to impress their neighbor, the tech industry collapses, the auto industry collapses, and GDP plummets. People think asceticism stalls progress.
But the researchers argue the exact opposite.
They argue that this 7th century version of detachment functioned as a massive turbocharged economic optimizer for the early Islamic civilization. How does that practically work?
It sounds totally counterintuitive to anyone trained in modern capitalist theory, but the logic of it is actually brilliant. It's functioned through a few specific mechanisms.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first mechanism is capital liberation. If you look at a normal empire throughout history, whether it's the Roman Empire, the Persian Sassanids, or a modern Western nation, what happens when the elite class accumulates surplus wealth?
They buy stuff. They spend it on luxury consumption.
Exactly. They build massive, sprawling palaces. They buy incredibly expensive art. They throw lavish banquets. They buy super yachts.
They tie the money up in things that signal their status.
Right. But from a strict macroeconomic perspective, luxury consumption is highly inefficient. It traps massive amounts of capital in non-productive assets. A solid gold chariot doesn't create ongoing jobs. A $50 million mansion doesn't produce goods for the society.
It's just dead money sitting there.
Exactly. But the early Muslims practiced this internal discipline of zuhd. They earned the money through trade, but their religious psychology severely restricted them from spending it on arrogance, luxury, or waste.
So you have these incredibly wealthy merchants with mountains of cash, and they aren't allowed to blow it on massive palaces. What do they do with it?
Here, you combine the internal discipline with the external legal obligation of zakat, the annual wealth tax on idle capital.
Oh, so they can't just hoard it either.
Exactly. If you just hoard the gold in a chest, zakat will slowly eat away at it year after year. If you spend it on prohibited luxury, you violate your spiritual principles.
So they are squeezed from both sides.
Right. The only rational, religiously sanctioned option left is to continuously reinvest that capital into productive commerce, agriculture, and public infrastructure.
So the money never stops moving. It is forced to circulate.
It spikes what economists call the velocity of money. Capital was constantly flowing. It was funding new trade expeditions to India and Africa. It was building new irrigation systems. It was creating jobs in the markets. The wealth wasn't sitting dead in a vault, and it wasn't being wasted on elite vanity projects. It was actively building the civilization.
And that leads directly into the second mechanism, which I think is one of the greatest innovations in economic history, the waqf system, the permanent charitable endowment.
It really is brilliant.
You mentioned earlier that Ali dug wells and made them a waqf. Because these believers were psychologically detached from their property, they didn't feel the neurotic need to hold on to every single asset forever just to pass down a massive aristocratic dynasty to their kids. They could take a highly valuable, income-producing asset and permanently endow it to the public.
The waqf system is arguably the greatest economic and civic gift of classical Islamic civilization.
How does it work legally?
The mechanics of it are simple but powerful. Legally, a waqf takes an asset, say an agricultural estate, a market building, or a well, and detaches the ownership from the individual.
So they don't own it anymore.
Right. The asset now belongs to God, effectively making it a public trust. And the revenue generated by that asset is dedicated in perpetuity to a specific charitable cause.
Forever.
Yes. Because the individual's identity and ego weren't tied to the title deed of the property, they could give it away permanently without experiencing an existential crisis. They didn't feel like they were losing a piece of themselves.
And the scale of this was massive. We aren't just talking about a few water wells.
Not at all. This mindset built the entire civic infrastructure of the pre-modern Middle East. When you look at history, waqf endowments built the first major public hospital.
The Bimaristan system, right?
Exactly. A wealthy individual would endow a massive farming estate outside the city. All the profits from selling the crops of that estate would go directly to funding a hospital inside the city.
So it had its own independent budget.
Yes. Because of that dedicated revenue stream, the hospital could offer top-tier medical treatment, medicine, food, and even clean clothes to every single patient completely for free.
That is incredible.
Waqfs built massive universities, massive libraries, caravanserais where travelers could stay safely, bridges, and aqueducts. The state didn't have to tax the poor to build these things because the wealthy elite were voluntarily liquidating their assets for the public good.
Just giving it away.
By the time we get to the Ottoman Empire centuries later, historians estimate that roughly 1/3 of all the arable land in the empire was held in waqfs.
1/3. I want the listener to really process that. 1/3 of the empire was essentially a privately funded public trust. You do not see that kind of massive structural philanthropy in a civilization that glorifies poverty. And you certainly don't see it in a civilization that worships wealth.
No, you don't.
You only see that in a civilization that generates massive wealth, but holds it with complete psychological detachment.
It creates a perfect contrast to a very famous sociological theory in the West. Max Weber, the German sociologist, wrote a hugely influential book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism.
Oh, I've heard of that.
He argued that modern capitalism was uniquely created in the West because of a specific Protestant mindset. The idea of working incredibly hard as a religious calling, but living austerely and reinvesting the profits.
Right.
But historians looking at the Islamic world point out that Muslims created a dynamic, intercontinental commercial system centuries before the Protestant Reformation, and they did it without the Protestant anxiety about proving their salvation.
How did they do it then?
They did it through a balanced combination of kas, which means ethical acquisition, the duty to work and trade, paired with this psychological detachment, Zud. Earn the world aggressively, but hold it lightly in your hand.
Okay, I want to push back on this with the logic of a modern economist, because the sources anticipate this exact critique.
Let's hear it.
If you eliminate social comparison, if you tell people they shouldn't care about status signaling, they shouldn't care about having a nicer house than their neighbor or wearing a more expensive watch, don't you kill the very motivational architecture of human ambition?
That is a very common fear.
Right. Why would anyone innovate? Why would a merchant take the massive risk of sending a trade convoy across the desert if they're already perfectly content eating simple food and living in a modest house? Where does the drive come from if you remove the desire for luxury?
It is a brilliant question, and it misunderstands a vital concept in the Islamic framework called qana'a, which we loosely translate as contentment.
Contentment. Usually that means just being happy with whatever you have and not trying for more.
Exactly. That is the modern definition. But contentment, in this classical context, is not the cessation of effort. It is the cessation of anxiety over outcomes.
Say that again, because that is a massive distinction.
Contentment is not the cessation of effort. It is the cessation of anxiety over outcomes.
Wow.
A Muslim entrepreneur in the 8th century still worked incredibly hard. They still tried to build the best product, negotiate the most favorable trade deals, and expand their market reach.
But why, if they didn't want the luxury?
Because cultivating the earth, providing for one's family, and generating surplus to support the community are considered religious obligations. Work itself is an act of worship if the intention is pure.
Ah, I see.
But their motivation to succeed was not driven by an insecure, desperate need to prove their worth to their neighbors. It was driven by a sense of stewardship.
That makes a lot of sense.
If we connect this to the broader arc of history, the great historian Ibn Khaldun wrote about this in his theory of asabiya, or social cohesion. He argued that it is actually luxury consumption and the obsessive pursuit of status that causes a civilization to rot from the inside out.
How's it?
When a society becomes obsessed with personal luxury, people become soft. They stop sacrificing for the collective good. They become paranoid about losing their status. Corruption spreads because people will do anything to maintain their lavish lifestyles. And ultimately, the civilization collapses.
So this psychology actually acts as a protective shield against decadence.
Yes, it preserves the collective drive to build and defend the community. It allows for aggressive, highly risk-tolerant commerce because the entrepreneur is not paralyzed by the fear of losing their social standing.
They can take big risks.
Exactly. If they send a caravan and it gets raided or the business fails, their core identity is completely intact. They just wake up the next day, say Alhamdulillah, and start over. That kind of fearless, anxiety-free commercial energy is an incredibly powerful force.
But how does a human being actually achieve that state?
Yeah.
Because it is very easy for us to sit here in the courtyard and say, just don't care about the outcome. It is much harder to do when you are in the arena.
It takes practice.
When you have poured your blood, sweat, and tears into building a business, or when you are looking at your retirement account dropping by 30% in a week, the human brain naturally panics. How did these early generations rewire their brains to not feel the crushing panic of loss?
They rewired it through a completely different metaphysical architecture of possession. It starts with a foundational legal and theological concept called khilafa al-mal, which translates to the stewardship of wealth.
Stewardship of wealth.
In classical Islamic law, there is a fundamental ontological claim. Human beings do not actually own property in the absolute sense. We are temporary trustees.
We don't own it at all.
The wealth, the land, the resources, they belong ontologically to God. The Quran explicitly tells believers to spend from that which God has made them successors or trustees over.
So I am not the owner of my house or my bank account. I am just the manager.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective, if you truly internalize it, performs what modern clinical psychologists might call attachment decoupling.
Attachment decoupling.
If you view yourself as a trustee rather than an absolute owner, losing wealth is not a loss of self. The true owner, God, has simply decided to withdraw the asset from your management and allocate it somewhere else. You aren't losing a piece of your identity. Your managerial portfolio has just been adjusted.
That is fascinating when you view it through the lens of modern behavioral economics. I want the listener to think about a famous concept developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky called loss aversion.
Oh, loss aversion. That fits perfectly here.
Right. If you are listening to this on your commute, imagine I offered you a bet. We flip a coin. If it lands on tails, you lose $100. If it lands on heads, you win $100. Most people will refuse that bet.
Even though the odds are even.
Exactly. Psychologically, humans feel the pain of losing something roughly twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of gaining that exact same thing. Losing $100 hurts way more than finding $100 feels good. We are biologically wired to fear loss.
Evolutionary biologists argue we develop that bias because in an ancestral environment, losing your food supply meant death, whereas gaining extra food was just a nice bonus. It is a powerful survival mechanism, but in a modern economy, it drives massive amounts of irrational anxiety.
But if you truly internalize this trustee mindset, this khilafa al-mal, it acts as a cognitive override to that biological bias. It is a loss aversion deactivation protocol.
I love that phrasing.
If the wealth was never truly mine to begin with, that I am just the temporary manager of God's money, then losing it doesn't trigger that deep existential panic. I might feel normal human disappointment. Sure, I have to figure out how to pay the bills, but my identity isn't dissolving. I am not destroyed.
You've captured it perfectly. And this psychological framework goes even deeper than just the legal concept of ownership. It goes into the actual physical psychophysiology of how we consume the world around us.
How so?
Yeah.
Like physically?
Yes. Al-Ghazali wrote extensively about this. He explored the deep connection between what we physically consume and how our brain and spirit function. He essentially mapped out the gut-brain axis nearly 1,000 years before modern neurobiology discovered the vagus nerve.
Wait, the gut-brain axis. You mean how the microbiome in your stomach sends signals to your brain that affect your mood, your focus, and your emotional regulation?
Precisely. Al-Ghazali argued that excess consumption, particularly overeating, is the primary gateway to spiritual and cognitive degradation.
Just from eating too much food.
Yes. He explained that when you overeat, the stomach requires massive amounts of energy to digest the food. It produces a physical heaviness in the body. That heaviness dulls your cognitive bandwidth. It reduces your capacity for sustained attention, vigilance, and deep thought.
It makes you sluggish.
And when your attention is dulled, you enter a state of heedlessness, a sort of waking sleep, which he viewed as the root of all moral and spiritual failure.
It's like that massive brain fog you get after eating a huge holiday meal. You are in a food coma. You aren't going to sit down and have deep philosophical thoughts or feel a sharp, piercing connection in your prayers when your body is aggressively trying to process 3 plates of rich food.
Exactly. Al-Ghazali actually created a brilliant taxonomy of eating. He broke human consumption down into 4 grades.
Okay, what are the 4 grades?
First, eating for subsistence. This is the absolute minimum nutrition required to keep the body functioning and the heart beating.
Just basic survival.
Right. Second, eating for health. This is a carefully calibrated level of nutrition designed to optimize your physical strength and mental clarity so you can fulfill your duties.
So eating clean, eating well.
Yes. Third, eating for desire. This is consuming food driven purely by appetite and the pleasure of taste, rather than physiological need.
Snacking, dessert.
And fourth, eating for excess. This is consumption that goes beyond desire and becomes pathological gluttony, where you eat until you are physically uncomfortable.
So where does this psychological discipline fit into that? Are we only allowed to eat for basic survival? Are we supposed to ignore the fact that food tastes good?
No, not at all. Al-Ghazali says the discipline means habituating yourself to the first 2 levels, subsistence and health. It means occasionally tolerating the third level, eating for desire, because Islam doesn't forbid enjoying good things.
Okay, that's a relief.
But you must implement strict structural disciplines like regular fasting to make sure the desire never takes control of the wheel and drives you into the 4th level of excess.
You have to stay in control.
He states very poetically but with deep psychological insight that the human heart is like a mirror. When the stomach is constantly full, he said, vapors rise from the stomach and fog the mirror, blinding the spiritual perception.
That is a powerful image.
So restrained consumption isn't just about being a good person or following a moral rule. It is a highly practical cognitive technology. It preserves your mental bandwidth. It keeps the mirror clean so you can actually perceive reality as it is.
Okay, I have to ask about the emotional cost of this worldview. Because if I am practicing this intense level of detachment, I view myself as a manager, not an owner. I am eating mostly for health, not pleasure. I am aggressively making sure I don't attach my identity to my things. Doesn't that turn you into a bit of an emotionless robot?
Not at all, but I see why you'd ask that.
Let me use an analogy to explain what I mean. If I rent a house instead of buying one, I know I am only going to be there for a year. Because of that, I probably won't cry when the lease is up and I have to move out. My identity isn't tied up in the title deed.
Right, it's just a rental.
But because I know I am only renting, I might never bother to paint the walls. I might never plant a garden in the backyard. I never truly love the house in the deep-rooted way an owner does. Does this philosophy mean we just float through life, renting everything, keeping everyone and everything at arm's length, and never truly loving the physical world around us?
I love that rental analogy because it actually perfectly highlights the exact freedom this mindset provides. You are entirely right that you do not own the house, but the assumption that you cannot love it or care for it or make it beautiful while you are there, that is where the modern logic breaks down.
Okay.
In the Islamic framework, you are explicitly commanded to care for the house. You are commanded to plant the garden. There is a famous tradition of the Prophet that says, even if you see the literal day of judgment beginning, the world is literally ending, and you have a small seedling in your hand, you should plant it.
Even if the world is ending?
Yes. You care for the world profoundly because the owner has entrusted it to you. You can absolutely enjoy the warmth of the house, the beauty of the garden, the taste of the food, the love of your family. But when the lease is up, when the wealth is lost, or when death approaches, you hand the keys back with profound gratitude for the time you had. You are not destroyed by the moving process because you always knew it was a rental.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a robot to be detached. You just have to be realistic about permanence.
Wow. You enjoy the intense beauty of the flower, but you don't break down and cry when it wilts because you never operated under the delusion that it was supposed to last forever. You always knew it was a flower.
Exactly. And this psychological realism leads to what Hassan al-Basri, one of the most famous early scholars, called the liberation paradox.
What's the paradox?
He pointed out that the person who desires nothing from the world is actually the most powerful person in it. He once said, "I have met people whose poverty for the world was richer than your richness for it." A man would be offered the world, and he would say, "I have no need for it." What could the Sultan do with such a man?
That is profound. What could the Sultan do with such a man? Think about the political implications of that. If you cannot be bribed with the promise of wealth, and you cannot be threatened with the fear of poverty, you are completely ungovernable by tyrants.
Yes. It is the ultimate form of political and social independence. If your status and your sense of safety aren't tied to your bank account, nobody can manipulate you by threatening to take your money away.
They have no leverage.
Exactly. Sufyan al-Thawri actually lived this reality. The Abbasid caliphs repeatedly tried to appoint him as a chief judge. It was a position of immense wealth, prestige, and power, and he kept refusing. He eventually had to go into hiding to avoid being forced into the role.
He hid from a promotion.
He did. He knew that accepting the state's money would make him dependent on the state's approval, and that dependence would eventually corrupt his ability to speak the truth. His internal detachment was the absolute ironclad guarantee of his intellectual freedom.
So we have this incredibly robust, psychologically sophisticated, empowering system. It produces leaders, highly successful merchants, fearless scholars, and massive public infrastructure. We are talking about men and women who are fully engaged in the world, generating wealth, but remaining completely sovereign over their own minds.
A truly balanced society.
So how in the world did we get from that dynamic, powerful reality to the stereotype we have today? How did this brilliant technology mutate into the idea of a starving hermit sitting in a cave wearing patched rags and weeping all day?
It was a long, gradual process of semantic mutation. The historians in the study track it across 4 distinct historical phases, and understanding this timeline is crucial to seeing how the original meaning was lost.
Okay, walk me through the phases.
We've spent a lot of time talking about phase 1, that is the 7th century, the prophetic era, and the time of the early caliphs. That was the era of active mastery where wealthy practitioners engaged the world fully but maintained that intense internal detachment.
The golden standard.
Right. But then society shifts into phase 2. This is the early Abbasid era, roughly 750 to 900 CE. The political and economic reality changed drastically. The Islamic Empire became unfathomably wealthy. A new court culture developed in the new capital of Baghdad that was characterized by spectacular, almost mind-boggling luxury.
We're talking about the golden age of Baghdad. Palaces, silk, gold, massive estate.
Absolutely. The caliphs were building palaces with mechanical trees made of silver and gold with jeweled mechanical birds that sang. It was absolute unprecedented decadence.
So the wealth became a problem.
Yes. In reaction to that extreme elite corruption, certain scholars and deeply pious individuals in the society began to overcorrect.
There was a moral backlash against the government's excesses.
Exactly. It was a backlash. They looked at the ruling class drowning in wealth, and they started emphasizing physical retreat. They started preaching extreme austerity and a deep, systemic suspicion of the state and of wealth in general.
They swung the pendulum too far the other way.
And crucially, at the exact same time, the expanding Islamic Empire was absorbing new cultures and translating foreign texts. They were encountering the ancient Christian monastic traditions of Syria and Egypt, which had a long history of desert fathers living in caves.
Okay, so cross-cultural influence.
Right. They were also translating Greek Neoplatonist philosophy, which taught a dualistic view of the universe. The idea that the physical material world is inherently corrupt and dirty, and only the pure non-physical spirit is good.
Wow.
These external philosophical ideas started bleeding into the Islamic discourse, subtly altering the original framework.
So they started equating the physical world itself with spiritual danger, rather than seeing the danger in the human heart's attachment to it.
Yes. The material world went from being a neutral tool to being an active enemy. And that leads directly into phase 3, roughly 900 to 1200 CE.
What happened then?
This is when the passive version of asceticism became institutionalized. You start seeing the widespread compilation of hagiographies, books written to praise famous saints and pious figures. And in these books, extreme physical deprivation is increasingly aestheticized and glorified.
Glorified poverty.
Yes. The ideal spiritual figure is no longer the wealthy merchant who funds hospitals. It is now depicted as someone wearing patched, coarse wool, weeping constantly in a corner, refusing to marry, refusing to work a normal job, and withdrawing completely from public life.
But wait, how did that become the ideal? The Prophet explicitly said there is no monasticism in Islam. That's a very clear, famous directive. If that was the rule, why were there so many popular stories praising guys who basically isolated themselves and acted exactly like monks?
That is the perfect question. And it is one that the classical scholars themselves fought bitterly over. The intellectual tradition actually contains a very robust, aggressive internal critique of this exact deviation.
Really, they pushed back against it back then.
Oh, absolutely. One of the best examples is a famous book called Talbis Iblis, which translates to The Devil's Deception. It was written by Ibn al-Jawzi in the 12th century.
Ibn al-Jawzi.
Yes. He was a rigorous, highly respected scholar in Baghdad, and he launched a massive, blistering critique against this false asceticism. He pointed out that wearing patched rags and isolating yourself had actually devolved into a form of spiritual vanity.
Spiritual vanity, meaning it became a way of showing off how humble you are to the public.
That is exactly what it was. It was status display, just inverted. Instead of showing off expensive silk to prove you were rich, they were showing off dramatically torn rags to prove they were holy. But the ego was still entirely involved. The heart was still obsessed with how other people perceived them.
That makes perfect sense. If you are constantly obsessed with how poor and humble you look, your heart is still deeply attached to the world's perception of you. You haven't escaped the matrix of status at all. You just changed the currency from gold to rags.
Precisely. It was the exact opposite of the original discipline, which is supposed to be invisible. True detachment doesn't draw attention to itself. Ibn al-Jawzi argued that taking the Prophet's occasional recommendations for simple living and turning them into rigid, extreme legal obligations, like refusing to eat meat or refusing to smile, was a massive deception of the ego.
And then what is phase 4?
Tragically, phase 4 is the colonial and post-colonial era. Orientalist scholars from the West arrived in the Muslim world during a period of steep civilizational decline. They saw these passive ascetic practices among certain groups, and they categorized them in their academic writing as Eastern fatalism or Islamic mysticism. They mapped it onto a caricature of an inherently lazy, socially passive East.
They just wrote it off.
And as Muslim societies underwent severe economic collapse, military defeat, and brutal colonization, many people internalized this external narrative. They took their objective material failure and their economic powerlessness, and they spiritualized it to cope with the pain.
Wow. They made it a coping mechanism.
He essentially said, we are poor, we are defeated, and we have no industries, but that is actually a good thing, because poverty is spiritual and God loves the broken. The original highly active sovereignty of the 7th century was completely inverted into a passive apology for civilizational failure.
That is heartbreaking when you track the arc of it. Taking an incredibly sophisticated technology of power and turning it into a coping mechanism for powerlessness.
It really is.
So let's bring this entirely into the present day, because we are not living in 7th century Medina, and we are not navigating the politics of 12th century Baghdad. We are navigating the 21st century. How do we actually survive this specific era using this ancient tech?
To apply it today, we have to honestly analyze the specific machinery of modern consumer culture. Modern capitalism operates on a psychological mechanism that behavioral economists call the hedonic treadmill.
Right, the hedonic treadmill. That is the well-documented idea that no matter what milestone you achieve or what luxury item you finally buy, your baseline level of happiness quickly resets. The thrill fades almost immediately, and you are forced to start chasing the next, more expensive thing just to feel normal again.
Exactly. Every acquisition briefly satisfies you, then the baseline resets and the desire escalates. It is a treadmill you can never step off of. And modern advertising is designed to weaponize this treadmill.
They know exactly what they're doing.
A commercial doesn't just sell you a car or a new phone. It sells you an identity. It sells you a sense of status, sexual appeal, and social belonging. The algorithms colonize your desires before you are even consciously aware of them. They figure out what your insecurities are, and they feed you images of products that promise to fix those insecurities.
And to be fair, Secular modernity knows this is a massive problem. People feel the exhaustion of it. You see so many desperate attempts in popular culture today to cure this constant burnout.
Oh, there's so many trends right now trying to fix it.
People are trying all these different secular life hacks. You have dopamine fasting in Silicon Valley, where tech executives lock their phones in a safe for the weekend just to reset their brains. You have the FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early, where young professionals live incredibly frugally, eating rice and beans for a decade so they can escape the corporate grind by age 40.
Right.
You have the massive revival of Stoicism. Everyone is suddenly reading Marcus Aurelius to learn how to emotionally detach from things they can't control. And of course, you have the huge trend of minimalism.
It is genuinely fascinating to watch from a sociological perspective. Secular culture is desperately trying to reinvent fragments of this ancient discipline without realizing it, because the human psyche simply cannot survive the constant, unrelenting barrage of manufactured desire. It causes deep psychological damage.
But these secular tools don't really work long-term, do they?
While they are helpful in the short term, they inevitably fall short. Take minimalism, for example. The original idea was great. Break the link between your identity and your commodities. Only own what sparks joy or serves a strict purpose.
Sure, clean up your house.
But within a few short years, minimalism was completely commercially captured. It stopped being a discipline and became an aesthetic. Now, you can go online and buy a $400 minimalist wallet. You can buy a $1,000 plain white t-shirt. You can hire expensive consultants to make your house look empty.
That is the ultimate irony.
The market absorbed the rebellion, repackaged it, and sold it right back to the consumer.
People are spending massive amounts of money to prove to other people how little they need.
And that happens because secular minimalism lacks any kind of ontological grounding. It is just a lifestyle choice based on personal preference. The Islamic framework is immune to that kind of commercial capture because it isn't based on an aesthetic. It is based on a theological reality. You are a steward, not an owner.
And it has the zakat, the charity part, built in.
Exactly. The secular movements lack built-in redistributive mandates. Minimalism tells you to stop buying junk, but it doesn't tell you what to do with the thousands of dollars you save. You usually just invest it to make yourself richer. The Islamic framework demands that the surplus capital be aggressively redirected into the community through zakat and waqf.
So how do we actually practice this today? Because I have to speak for the modern listener here who is trying to balance all of this. Look, this entire historical and psychological breakdown sounds amazing in theory, but I live in the real world. I have a 30-year mortgage I have to pay. I have car payments. I have to maintain a polished LinkedIn profile to network and get a job to feed my kids. I have to play the game of office politics, at least a little bit, just to survive the next round of corporate layoffs.
We all do.
Is this level of supreme detachment actually achievable for a regular person today? Or is this just a philosophical luxury for people who are already rich enough to not care about the rules?
It is absolutely achievable, but it requires what we might call cognitive zood. It is about actively applying this ancient psychology to the modern attention economy and the modern corporate environment.
Okay, what does cognitive zood look like on a Tuesday at the office?
In a corporate job, this practice looks like role distance. It means you put on the suit, you create the professional LinkedIn profile, you negotiate hard for your salary, and you do your job with excellence. But you do not, under any circumstances, let the suit become your skin.
Wow. Don't let the suit become your skin.
You recognize that the professional persona is merely a tool. It is a mechanism to acquire provision to support your family and benefit your community. If you get the big promotion, you say alhamdulillah, and you use the extra resources and influence for good. If you get laid off tomorrow, you do not suffer an existential breakdown because your fundamental human worth was never tied to your job title in the first place.
You are playing the game, you know the rules, but you are fully aware it's a game. You don't mistake the game for reality.
Exactly. And regarding the attention economy, social media, algorithms, the endless doom scroll, this discipline requires strict algorithmic hygiene.
Algorithmic hygiene.
The algorithms on your phone are explicitly engineered to trigger envy, social comparison, and endless desire. The modern practitioner has to actively curate their digital environment. You turn off the push notifications, you ruthlessly unfollow accounts that trigger status anxiety or make you feel inadequate.
You just cut them out.
You treat your attention as a sacred trust, just like wealth. Because every single minute given to mindless scrolling is a minute of cognitive bandwidth stolen from your true purpose.
It is almost about becoming unintelligible to the algorithm. And the algorithm feeds on your insecurities and desires for status, and you actively cure yourself of those desires. The algorithm doesn't know what to do with you.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The algorithm works by predicting what you want based on your behavioral data. It profiles you based on what you covet. But if your desires are not dictated by social status, if you are genuinely content with what you have, the market cannot manipulate you.
You break the machine.
You become the one data point they cannot model. You break the feedback loop. This ancient discipline isn't about running away from modern capitalism to live in the woods. It is about mastering it by refusing to be colonized by it.
We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started by completely redefining this ancient concept, moving far away from the stereotype of the starving hermit in patched rags.
A total paradigm shift.
We learned that the linguistic root implies a scarcity of regard, a calibrated, highly active psychological power over the material world, not a passive lack of it. We looked at the stunning historical reality of the early companions, men like Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf and Uthman ibn Affan.
The true examples.
We saw how they controlled vast, multi-continental wealth, funded armies, and managed logistical empires, yet lived with intense personal austerity. They proved that holding the world in your hands does not mean it has to enter your heart.
And we explored how that specific mindset acted as the civilizational engine for the early Islamic economy. By refusing to engage in elite luxury consumption, they kept capital moving. They built the massive waqf system, endowing hospitals and universities, proving that detachment doesn't stall progress. It fuels structural philanthropy and protects the society from the rot of decadence.
We also dug deep into the psychology of it. The concept of khilafa al-mal, viewing ourselves as temporary stewards rather than absolute owners, which brilliantly short-circuits our evolutionary fear of loss. We explored al-Ghazali's profound insights into the gut-brain axis, showing how minimizing excess consumption actually preserves our cognitive bandwidth and keeps the mirror of the heart clean.
So important for today.
And finally, we traced the historical tragedy of how this empowering technology mutated over the centuries into a mere aesthetic of poverty, and how we desperately need to reclaim the original framework today to survive the hedonic treadmill and the algorithmic manipulation of modern life.
It truly is a complete paradigm shift, and I want to leave the listener with a final thought to reflect on as they go about their day. We spend so much of our lives trying to achieve financial independence. We hustle, we invest, we obsess over our retirement accounts, all because we deeply believe that if we just accumulate enough wealth, we will finally feel free. We think money will eventually buy us peace from the anxieties of the world.
We all think that way.
But what if true liberation isn't about accumulating enough wealth to stop worrying about the world? What if it is about cultivating a state of mind where the world simply loses its power to worry you at all, regardless of what your bank balance says today?
That is the ultimate sovereignty. Ask yourself today, do you own your possessions or do your possessions own you? Look at the things you are chasing, the social status you're protecting, the digital feeds you are endlessly scrolling. Who is really in control? May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.